feel like we're having a little bit of like a twinning moment.
Yes.
Like the forest green. Yeah.
It's Green Day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for saying yes to this opportunity and meeting with me.
Thanks.
I'm doing a series of videos right now where I'm interviewing designers who work at startups. And as anyone would do when they're seeking for some awesome people to interview, they go to Twitter. So I post a message up there seeing if anyone else was interested in being on my channel to talk about their role as a designer working at a startup. And just about everyone in the thread mentioned Parker. So I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. I guess just to start off, I'd love for you to share just who are you? What's your story? Yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to chat. And then I guess my story. So I grew up in the Bay Area and kind of got introduced to computers and technology and like this whole world really young. I think by the time I was like 12, 13, was like programming and starting to kind of like learn about the like startup industry and the kind of community here. Spent basically all of high school doing contract and like freelance design and software engineering work for small startups. And then that kind of rolled into taking a job as a product designer at a startup down in Los Angeles right after I graduated high school. So I didn't go to college, and then bounced around a couple startups down there, ended up kind of randomly working at Red Bull for 2 years, leading some product design there. And then most recently, before my current role, was at a company called Canvas, that is a recruiting software company. And then that kind of put me down this path of recruiting software, which landed me where I am now, which is at a company called Pallet, where I lead product and design. I've been at Pallet for, I think it's like 7 months now. So I'm like relatively new. I'm one of the newer people on the team, but we're still like seed stage. So at that stage, everything goes so fast. I feel like I've been here for like years. But yeah, that's kind of the short story about me.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, we're going to come back to Palette. There's a lot there, but there's a couple things I want to bring up. A little bit about me. I recently moved to San Diego, but prior to that, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 9 years. I was a transplant, much like a lot of people who are in San Francisco, but you grew up there. So that's that. First of all, that is really awesome. I love meeting people who are locals. Also, so incredible to hear that you got into design and software engineering in high school. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? I think there's so many more people who could have that opportunity. Like I always wish I would have discovered design in high school, but I didn't until I was in college. So.
I guess I could say like a product of my environment almost. I think growing up in the Bay Area, like you're kind of subjected to a lot of things that like you aren't outside of the Bay Area. So like I had friends growing up whose parents like were software engineers at like Google and like these companies where like other areas that you grow up in, you don't have that. And then it all started with me wanting to make video games. So I started learning like, I think the first one was probably like Scratch, which is kind of like the introduction to like programming. And then you start doing more and you're like, oh wait, I want to like make my own characters. So then I was like pirating Photoshop and teaching myself Photoshop. At some point, I don't know if there was like a specific kind of event or instance that kind of propelled it, but I started kind of learning a little bit more about like the tech industry and realizing that like, oh, these games and things that I sit on my computer in my free time after school doing, like people can get paid for that. And that kind of coincided with me like getting on Twitter for other things and then kind of finding out that like tech Twitter and design Twitter were a thing. So through that was able, while I was in high school, to kind of like meet a bunch of people and really kind of like start to learn and start to kind of connect with others in this industry. And then it's kind of just stayed down that path for the last like 5-6 years.
Yeah. I don't know if this matters much, but do you feel like you discovered the engineering, like building side first or the design side?
Definitely engineering side. I would say I always joke that I am a designer because I'm a failed engineer, because I hit points with engineering that I was like, this is really hard and I don't have interest in this. So like, I'm going to stick to like, originally it was like, oh, I'm going to stick to like front end engineering and kind of building interfaces. And then I was like, wait, I think I'd rather actually like design these than just like program them.
Yeah, cool. Maybe we'll come back to that. I think that is so cool. You mentioned this a little bit, I think, on your website when I was looking at it. And then you mentioned it a little bit earlier. You've worked at a couple other companies before Pallet. So I guess I'm just curious, like, why have you chosen or did you choose to work at startups or smaller companies versus going the other path?
I mean, initially, I don't necessarily think it was like intentional. When I was in school and like doing kind of random little like freelancing projects, it just kind of happened that like the companies that were approaching me and the companies that I was working with were super small. So like a lot of them, it was like a founder or like one person and an engineer. And then they're like, we need to design an app. And so initially it kind of just like happened that like, that was like the environment I was used to. And that was kind of where I had like a little bit of a network for when I started job searching. And then I think I've kind of come back to it. So like I mentioned, I went to Red Bull, which is obviously like a massive global company. The kind of design team for like digital product design and like and then like the software engineering team there is only like 100 people, but that was still like probably 10 times the size of what I was used to. Before Red Bull, the company I was at was called T2IL and it was like 4 people. So it was like a pretty massive jump. And working there and then at Canvas, where I was immediately after, which when I joined was like 40 people. And by the time I left around a year later, we were like 110. So we exploded while I was there. And I think what I realized was just, I enjoy the earlier kind of stages of like product development and company building. So jumped back to when I joined Pallet, I think I was like number 8 or 9, super early. I get to kind of dip my feet in and dip my toes into a lot of different areas. I'm like doing design, obviously. And then the next day I might kind of jump in, do some engineering, and then I'm helping with marketing and stuff like that. So, and I enjoy being in those types of environments, which I think is what's one of the big kind of main drivers of like starting and then I'll eventually coming back to like a company of this size.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, I think we'll talk more about that too in a little bit here, but I want to jump in and talk more about Pallet. I think Pallet is one of the kind of coolest up and coming creator tools that is out there. I'm currently a customer like user of Pallet, so maybe that's a little bit biased, but I think it's one of the coolest creator tools that is out there right now. So yeah, I guess just in your words, how would you describe Pallet to someone who is not familiar with it?
To keep it simple, I guess, but Pallet allows people like yourself, creators, influencers, community leaders, to bring another kind of value prop to their community, which is connecting individuals in their community who are looking for jobs with individuals in their community who are hiring. Right now, the primary kind of means that we do that is through a job board. Kind of like the thesis we're built on is that hiring right now is very broken because we are using the same kind of pipelines that we have been using for 20, 30 years, but we're expecting to get different results. As we've all seen, like the last couple of years, there's kind of this renewed focus on diversity and inclusion and making sure that you're getting kind of a proper representation in your pipeline. But we're hoping for that. And we're still going to LinkedIn, we're still going to the same job sites that we're used to. So our hope with Pallet is that by kind of dispersing this candidate pool from being this one like mega pool of like tens of hundreds of millions of people to being tens of thousands of smaller pools of 100 people or less, we can kind of build better representation of like the overall kind of market, but also kind of help companies hire people that they otherwise would have missed.
That's really cool, Parker. I love it. It really does seem like there's some really interesting problems to be solved as they relate to recruiting and hiring. So you're leading up the design and product team. Is that right?
Yeah. I guess right now it's just me, but yes.
So yeah, okay, yeah. So talk more about that. What does that mean as being like the person who is leading the design and product effort? And then what would you say is longer term vision for how that's going to shape out?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, what it means is that I'm very busy. But my role in particular spans everything from product strategy and planning and like early stage kind of market research through execution and delivering design work to our engineers. Our engineering team right now is 4 people, a fairly comfortable kind of like workload with like making sure I'm getting stuff done so that they're constantly going. When we start hiring more engineers, I'm already starting to think of like, okay, like we're going to need a second designer and what does that person look like? And I've always kind of gravitated more towards the like product-y side of design. So I'll likely continue to take on like more of the like product management, product strategy type stuff as the company evolves.
So would you say you're also the only, so you're the only person that's would also be considered a product manager? Is that right?
Yeah, we kind of split the responsibilities of like what a product manager would do between myself and our CTO when it comes to like sprint planning and that side of things that I guess kind of may fall more in like the project strategy or project management, depending on who you're talking to. He handles all of that stuff, and then I handle most of the kind of like more strategic stuff alongside our CEO.
So as like sort of a team of one amongst a smaller team within a startup, do you feel like you've established any rituals or, maybe as the team does grow, especially as it relates to design, what is the culture that you want to cultivate there at Pallet?
It's a really good question. Relatively recently, we've started kind of establishing rituals. At the end of a project before release, everybody gets on a Zoom call or a video call, and we kind of work through and do like a big kind of what we've labeled like a QA party. It usually ends up being like early in the day or late in the day. So a lot of people, it's like, oh, it's like I'm making my coffee and then I'm gonna sit on a Zoom for an hour and like poke and prod at the product. So that's one thing that I've started doing, and we're slowly kind of opening it up and getting more people in the company involved just to get some more kind of fresh perspective. And then I think the one thing I'm still trying to find a way to replicate as the only designer has been like design critiques. That is by far like the one thing I miss the most from being on a design team with other designers. I haven't quite found like a way to successfully like replicate that without any other designers. So I think that's what I'm most excited about in like the next, whatever, 3, 6 months when we will likely hire another designer, is having somebody to talk nerdy design stuff with in a critique format.
Well, okay, let's circle back though. Like, what do you do for if you need design critique? Like, what happens right now? What does it look like?
I text my friends,
Nice, nice.
or I send a unprompted like Loom video of me like spewing my thoughts. That's kind of been what it is, and like we'll have kind of internal discussions, but I think as I'm sure you know, like talking to designers about design stuff and talking to product managers or engineers, like you have very different conversations. So for now, yeah, I've kind of built a small, what I guess I'll call my support group, where I have a group text with friends and I'll just kind of like drop a text with like a screenshot and like notes, or if it's really kind of in depth, I'll send like a long Loom video and then hope that someone has the free time to watch it or respond. I don't know. I have to get creative with it, which is fun, but also
Yeah.
stressful sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure. I love that though. I don't think that's dissimilar to what I've heard from other people who are in a similar situation to you as like the solo designer on their team. And I think the design community is also just so collaborative, or people are just, really willing to help. So I think it's great. I think finding your people is really important, the people that you trust, and be able to like go to them for feedback. So that's cool that you've got that going for you. What would you say you're most challenged with in this role?
I mean, definitely like a really interesting one that I think is probably, in my experience, unique to Pallet is we have 3 primary kind of like users on the platform, all of which have very differing jobs to be done and ways in which they use the product, which makes designing the product very kind of interesting, thinking about it from every different angle. But it also makes like thinking about what we're working on and like kind of like setting a product strategy for things really complicated, because there isn't always like this direct connection between everything.
Very cool. I guess somewhat related then, what would you say are you most excited about in this role?
I guess the most obvious thing is just like the evolution of the product. I think it's like right now it's at a really interesting time with where we're finding traction, which has been in a lot of it's been in like the crypto and Web3 space, which is really interesting because it's like, oh, like what is recruiting for temporary jobs? Because a lot of it's in like these like almost like voluntary, like, oh, you join a DAO and then you get paid when you contribute, but no one's like asking you to contribute. So like, what does recruiting in that context look like? And then on top of that, like something in the space that I've always been interested in is like, how can we take hiring and take recruiting and kind of humanize it past the resume? And I think we have a really interesting opportunity here by like deeply connecting and integrating with the communities. We can see like, oh, like, are these people like really engaged in the community? Are they helping other people? And we can kind of like start surfacing that as almost like achievements and other kind of like accolades that are relevant towards a recruiter, outside of just like a list of like the companies you've worked at.
Very cool, Parker. I'm excited to see how Pallet evolves and grows as well. Seems like there is a lot of opportunity. You mentioned that obviously you're this like team of one right now. You've got your hands in a lot of baskets. The team will have to grow as the product is growing, and that you might hire a designer at some point. So in your mind, like who would be, if someone was interested, if a designer was interested at working at a startup like Pallet, in your mind, what would be the best way that they can position themselves? What sort of candidate would you be looking for, skills wise, experience wise?
I mean, I think off the top of my head, the most important thing is like someone who kind of that I can work well with and that works well with me and that we complement each other. So definitely someone whose strength in like visual design. I think the more specialized piece of it is someone who has interest or is strong in like growth design as well. That is like very transparently not one of my strong suits. So it's been interesting, like with the type of product we have, like there's a lot of work that is encompassed by growth where we're worrying about funnels and a lot of different flows that we're dealing with.
No, that's interesting because I work at a much larger company. I work at Zendesk and our team is quite large, but even at like a large scale, we kind of think about it in a similar way. We have a team of awesome people, awesome designers. They all have differing set of skills and experiences. And then when we hire people, we also try to think about like where are the gaps in like on our team. But the difference at a startup is that it's maybe just 2 people. So you can get really, really specific about it. So anyway, I think that's interesting that you brought it up that way because we kind of think about it too, but at a much larger scale. Yeah, different challenges or like opportunities, I guess, that come with the 2 sides of it. I don't know if you brought this up at the beginning, but if not, could you just tell me again, how did you specifically find this opportunity with Pallet?
Before it was Pallet, it was a company called Cardea. And I had found out about Cardea through Twitter and then some friends of mine who were some of the early investors in the team. And that was probably like a year or so ago. So it was well before I had joined. And then I found out about this specific role from one of those friends who was an investor, helped them kind of like shape the role. And he texted me about it. And I was like, yeah, I'm like not interested. And he just kind of like kept texting me and kept asking me about it. And then I was finally like, oh, like, sure, I'll talk to him. Like, we'll see what happens. And sure enough, here I am. I think it was probably over the course of like 2 months, maybe a little longer. The more I talked to them, the more excited I got about it. And then eventually I was like, well, I have to. Like, I want to work here. Yeah.
That's cool. You know, it always kind of comes back down to the relationships, I think, or like the people you surround yourself with. You brought this up at the beginning too. You know, you found or you felt like you discovered design and software engineering. You know, having been in the Bay Area, a lot of that's happening. So it kind of like expedited that interest for you maybe a bit because you were surrounded by it. So I see that similarly happening with, how you found.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
The other thing that I think is so interesting is that, I mean, I've only done 3 interviews so far for this series. I'm planning to do more, but 2 out of the 3 people I've interviewed have said that they found their startup job because of a Twitter conversation. And there is something to be said about that.
Yeah, it is. I use it very similar to like what people think LinkedIn's for, but it's much more like personal, obviously, as you know. That's always my number 1 tip to people. It's like, get on Twitter and you'll, if you want to work in this industry.
I agree. That's my tip as well. 2 out of 3 people so far. Not a lot of data points, but it's something.
Yeah.
Okay, to wrap up this interview, I wanted to just kind of end with a fun sort of question. Again, I was looking at your website, doing a little research to set up questions for this interview, and I saw that you have this list of questions that you ponder on a daily basis or a monthly basis, what have you. And one of them, the very first one, I really liked, and I wanted to check in, see if there was any updates on your thoughts in regards to this question. So the question is, what defines quality in software?
This is probably like a can of worms for me a little bit. Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in this question because I think I'm a little bit of like a history of computing nerd a bit. Like I like to kind of read and research about like the early days of like computing and stuff. And one of the kind of trends that you see, and you can even see it over the course of like the last 10 years, is like software now is like, it's okay to ship it when it has a bunch of bugs. You'll like look at it and like as designers, we're always like, wait, that there's like it's off by like 2 pixels, or like you wouldn't know, or like things like that like when you look backwards at like older things, especially like if you use Apple as the example, they like if you look at early Apple interfaces, like they were like perfect, right? Like they were very meticulous about it. And over time, that for everybody basically has become less and less of kind of an important thing when you think of like the user interface of it. But then also like the programming aspect, like code, and when you're like a code base, like it's a lot, the value of keeping it like well organized and well kind of architected is like steadily kind of decreased over time because the focus is on like speed of shipping, getting things out, business output or business impact and everything like that. So I think for me, like when I think of this question, there isn't really like an answer. And I think that's why it's something that's interesting for me to kind of like ponder and keep my brain busy. But I think the big thing for me is when I think about like what I think of as like a quality interface or like a quality design, it has this feeling of like completeness to it, where like you can look at it and you feel like, okay, like all the buttons, all the padding and everything is like very intentionally done this way. And it just feels sturdy and complete.
Very cool. I think it's so important as designers or people who are especially in tech jobs and technology to be knowledgeable and appreciative of something that is well made, well crafted, well created, well built, coded, what have you. And that if you were to ask someone what their favorite software tool was or their favorite app or website, that often people have not thought about that. And I think that's really important that we do think about that. So I really like that you have this as one of your questions, that you ponder it. The thing that actually stood out to me that made me think about was that my dad is also a designer. He's also a product designer. And something that he taught me early on that has stuck with me. And I think this is something that was maybe more of a thing number of decades back, but my dad used to design Adobe software. And so I think it was when you were loading like Photoshop, for example, or exiting, there'd always be this loading screen and it would have the names of the people who helped create it. And he would be like, Lexa, my name is there, which is really cool, right? And he was proud of it. Like he would put his name on it. So I almost feel like it's sort of similar to what you were saying. It's like it feels complete, like you're proud of it. When it's quality, it's something you'd put your name on it. And so I wonder if we all could strive for that a little bit with our work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super important thing. And I think you're spot on. Like something I've actually like toyed around with is like adding a credits page to a product or something like that. Like go to the settings page and scroll all the way down and you see like a little list of all the people that worked on it. Because I think there is like a psychological thing of like when you share something personally versus when it's like, oh, like I work at this company. We should do that.
Put credits back in software.
Yes, more name, adding our names to things. It'd be fun.
Yes. Okay. Something to ponder. Parker, this was a pleasure. If people want to learn more about you, your background, about Pallet, all the things, where should they go?
Ooh, probably Twitter or my website. I'm basically on most social platforms and the internet. I go by Parker Hendo, which is my first name, Parker, and then Hendo. It's a nickname I got when I was younger because I had a close friend with the same last name. So we had to differentiate. But yeah, I hang out on Twitter quite a bit and then try to keep my website up to date. And I use it as like a little playground to kind of try new things, build random stuff, add pages like the questions page that I added like randomly one morning. So yeah, those are probably the two places for me personally. And then Pallet, where I'm working, is pallet.com. Yeah, more designers too. That's the big thing. Everybody wants to hire designers. So it's like a perfect place to be.
Yeah, excellent. All those links will be in the description below. Yeah, I encourage everyone to go to Parker's website and look at the rest of the questions that he's pondering and then go tweet at him because he tweets a lot of great tweets. And yeah, well, there was one other thing I was going to say. Oh, I totally agree with you as it relates to more designers should be on Pallet. My Pallet's all about remote design jobs. Since I'm a remote designer now, I have been since 2020, but I've officially been remote for the last year. And so I'm trying to curate roles for people all around the best jobs to work at as a designer. I think that's going to wrap up the interview for today. Thank you so much. This was so great.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.
Good. Well, thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.
Have a good one. You too.
Bye.